Okay, good morning, everybody. We're just a little bit late. We'll blame that on the rain, but glad to have all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. We've got, the rain has got our numbers down just a tad, but I'm confident we're going to fill all that in quite shortly. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president at CSIS, and I want to say a sincere welcome to all of you. When we started planning for this conference, and Ambassador Osius, a great partner for us, when we started planning this conference, it was a different world. And my goodness, we've had 4 kind of tectonic developments that have just fundamentally reshaped things over the last several weeks and months. Of course, we have the first, of course, is the aftershocks of the COVID recession and the supply chain disruptions. That's been enormous, and of course we're still seeing all of that. We still haven't gotten all of our electronics working again because we've got chips someplace on a boat, flying over someplace. I don't know where they are. We're waiting. So we've had the supply chain disruption that came from COVID. And then we've seen something very profound, which we still don't fully understand, and that is this new shift inside China that's kind of changing the dynamic of how the Communist Party is going to manage their economy. Now there's this label called shared prosperity, is the term that's being used for this, but we still don't know where that's going. But it does look like there's going to be more government intervention in the marketplace. And it certainly has elevated risk calculus, for businesses as they're thinking about their future. So that's the second thing that's happened. The third thing, of course, is we had a remarkable summit between President Xi and President Putin, where they said that their partnership has no limits. Okay. Now, it's unclear that President Xi knew what was coming with the invasion in Ukraine, and China does appear to be trying to capture its balance again. It's a little off balance with all of that, but nonetheless, it really has shifted the geopolitical landscape rather profoundly, and we're all wondering, okay, where does that go? And then the fourth big shock has been the profound use of economic sanctions, something that we've not seen before. We've had little things before, but nothing of this scale before. And, everybody say, where does this go? What is it, what happens if China companies get involved in a way? Does it cause additional sanctions? It's just, everything is really now up in the air. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been, on a personal basis, because of another obligation I have, I've been polling senior business people to ask, what do you think is happening with supply chains on a global basis? And I've given people 3 options to vote on. The first option was, well, the fundamentals are still there. It's harder to work in China, but we're going to still kind of work through that. We can make it work. It's going to be tougher, and we'll do it. That's the first option. The second option is businesses want to change, but there are so many impediments. It's so hard to get regulatory clearance in Western economies. They're not open to it, but we do think there are going to be changes coming. And the third option was businesses have realized it's a different world, and they are making big changes right now. Okay. Those were the 3 options I gave them, and I was surprised at the results. 50%, 45% of the respondents said, we're really changing. Things are really changing. Another 25% said, it's going to be slow. Things are changing. It's going to be slow, but because of the regulatory structures, it's not a lot going to come onshoring, And then 27% said, we'll muscle our way through this complex problem with China. Okay. Now, if you put those together, what it really says to me is there are fundamental movements underway. economic movements underway in supply chains, and the large beneficiary of this is going to be ASEAN countries. That's really what this says. We've got these 4 tectonic developments, and we're in the middle of them, so it's a little hard to have, to make solid predictions, but it's pretty clear where it's heading, and I think that's the backdrop for this very important conference. And I do want to say my sincere thanks to Ted Osius and his team over at the ASEAN Business Council. I don't think they had foresight into everything that was going to be coming up, but boy, was it good timing. And so I want to say congratulations, Ted. Thank you to you and your team. And I'm very glad that all of you are here, and we've got a large audience that's dialing in. That's more of the mode these days, but we're glad that those of you who are in the room are with us today. Now let's get on with the program. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamry. That was a fantastic way to really, for all of us to get ready for the second day of discussion, looking at this, one of the most dynamic regions in the world. And I have the pleasure to moderate this panel on energy transition. My name is Jane Nakano. I'm Senior Fellow with Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. I'm an energy person as opposed to more of a regional person, but I've been looking at how this region has been going through a lot of challenges, but then also really seizing on many opportunities the last 2.5 decades. And it's an interesting time, challenging time, but also an exciting time. And I'm just pleased to be joined by this excellent 3 speakers representing different facets of the society. I mean, U.S. government, multilateral development bank world, and think tank. And what I'm going to do is, I think we're all here to really hear from the 3 experts. So let me invite 3 speakers first, and then I'll do a moderated Q&A just a bit, and also invite those of you in the audience to ask some questions at the end. Without further ado, Undersecretary Jose Fernandez, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I should tell you that my talking points said thank you for that warm introduction, but
oh, sorry. Yeah. Since you're well known, I'm going to skip, and in the interest of time, I apologize.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, John. Where are you? Somewhere out there. For talking about those 4 tectonic changes, and that's an understatement. We've seen some really major changes that are frankly going to change our careers and our lives for many years to come. Thank you also to CSIS, to the US-ASEAN Business Council for organizing the event. And what I'd like to do is just touch upon 3 items very briefly in the 5 or 6 minutes that I've been asked to speak. Number 1, how we maintain energy security for each of our nations in the region. Number 2, how we can meet growing demands to fuel our economies. And third, how we do both of these things while at the same time tackling climate change. On energy security, if we ever needed a reminder, Russia's attack on Ukraine has brought to the forefront the importance of energy security globally. Energy fuels our economies, and when prices increase or we can't get the energy, our economies suffer, and we've seen that. Today, the world is feeling the impact of Russia's actions, but we're also, and this is the good news, we're also finding new ways to come together and to support each other. John talked about sanctions, but we've seen many nations also in the Indo-Pacific region that have come to the aid of the European nations as well, and Ukraine and, for example, Japan, diverting LNG shipments from Japan to Europe, and that was something that we were very grateful for. But it's not just Putin's war of choice that's creating concerns. The other good news here is that if you look at our recovery, our economic recovery, we've had a success in terms of coming back from the pandemic. The demand never fell. If anything, our demand has increased. What has suffered is the supply chains, and that's something obviously that we need to work on. Along with the geopolitical events, rapid economic recovery and growth is resulting in increased energy demand, and that's why it's critical that we work with our Indo-Pacific allies and partners, including those of you in the private sector, to build a better climate future, mitigate near-term energy disruptions, and deepen our economic engagement. This connection between the region's economic and climate future is why President Biden held a summit with leaders from Australia, India, and Japan, what we're calling the Quad, in March of last year, and established a climate change working group. Quad partners are working to accelerate the clean energy transition in our own economies by advancing low emissions technology solutions such as clean hydrogen that will allow us to decarbonize sectors like shipping and to promote reduction in methane emissions. Quad members are also working together to advance our shared values in supporting the region's clean energy transition. For example, Australia, which is a member of the Quad, will host an Indo-Pacific Clean Energy Supply Chain Forum later this year to support responsible and clean energy supply chains. And Quad partners are also working with ASEAN through the East Asia Summit Energy Cooperation Task Force and other venues to support clean energy goals. We also realize that we need to bring regional organizations on board to encourage collective action. That's why we welcome ASEAN's leadership in Southeast Asia's clean energy transition, and that's where we're working with ASEAN to support the norms and principles in its strategic vision statement, what they're calling the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and also to align Quad efforts where feasible. So what we're going to do is remain committed to strengthening our long-standing cooperation with ASEAN while launching new high-level engagement on climate change, the environment, and energy. And we were very proud to hold the first US-ASEAN ministerial meeting on energy last year that was led by Secretary Granholm, and we look forward to having many more of those meetings going forward. But as John mentioned, and as we all realize, we really can't talk about energy without recognizing the impact that Russia's aggression has had on the global economy. Russia's further invasion of Ukraine has disrupted oil and gas supplies and increased energy costs. These are disruptions that affect not just Europe, but also the ASEAN region, and that's what we've worked tirelessly, and we'll continue to work tirelessly with partners around the world to increase transparency and to reduce uncertainty in the crude oil markets. At the end of March 31st, President Biden announced the release from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve of an amount equivalent to 1 million barrels of oil per day for the next 6 months. Additionally, IEA members agreed to a second collective release of oil a couple of days later. These are releases that will be in addition to and considerably larger than the 63 million barrel collective release of oil that was announced earlier in March. So if you take one thing away from my talk today, is this. We are prepared to use every available tool to limit disruption to global energy supplies, and you're seeing it already. And we will also continue at the same time, and this is no contradiction, we will also continue our efforts to continue and accelerating the diversification of energy supplies and supporting the clean energy transition so that we can ensure the Indo-Pacific's long-term energy security. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary. And I apologize, I think I completely skipped your title since I'm so focused on just wanting to welcome you to the stage. But as you may know, he's the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment at State Department. I think it's, I'm just really glad that you highlighted all these. So obviously, Dr. Hamry talked about sort of four more overarching sort of challenges, things that are developing. But even within this energy and climate and energy transition arena, there are so many things that are happening, and then also that what the United States government is trying to do. But let me save my questions until everyone else is done. But next, let me welcome Leslie Biermann. She's the representative of the North America Representative Office of the Asia Development Bank here in Washington, D.C. Would you like to go to podium or whatever works for you?
I'll just stay here.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning, and thank you for having me here today. I've been asked to talk about the energy transition from the perspective of a multilateral development bank. And since we're a regional development bank focused in the Asia-Pacific region, it makes sense that I can talk about this. So I think we have to start from the premise that the battle against climate change will be won or lost in Asia. I think that's just a fact that we all have to recognize. Asia-Pacific region accounts for more than 50% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And since we're a development bank, we need to be cognizant of the fact that the climate change has eroded many of the gains that the Asia-Pacific countries have made in recent decades. So from our perspective, accelerating the energy transition in the Asia-Pacific region is vital to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. However, we need to ensure that the transition is just, inclusive, and sustainable. So with the current COVID-19 crisis and the energy crisis that Undersecretary Fernandez spoke about, many of our developing member countries are struggling to realize their climate ambitions as well as maintain energy security. So our bank has a central role in supporting our country's efforts to meet these challenges, and we're developing a number of innovative solutions to try to address these challenges as part of our strategic response. So just to list a few, ADB raised its climate ambition to $100 billion of climate finance cumulatively from 2019 to 2030. We've also committed to fully align our operations to the Paris Agreement by 2023 for our sovereign operations and 2025 for non-sovereign or private sector operations. We've also recently adopted a new energy policy, which we formally withdraw from financing of new coal-fired power plants. We hadn't actually financed anything since 2013, but we formalized that policy. But the unfortunate fact is that the legacy coal-fired power plants remain the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And in Asia, we face the situation where these plants are relatively young. They're and newly come online. So if they're not retired from operation, they're going to continue for decades. They're going to continue polluting, and they'll block meaningful pathways to develop, reduce emissions and develop new sources of renewable energy. So one of the initiatives ADB has undertaken is what we call the Energy Transition Mechanism, or ETM, if I can call it that. Basically, when we're talking about energy transition, we're referring to the structural change from a model of energy production based on fossil fuels to one based on renewable and other zero-carbon energy sources. But the speed of the transition will differ depending on a country's level of development, their national resource endowments, the strength of their capital markets to attract private finance. So it's not going to be consistent across the region. So we launched the Energy Transition Mechanism at COP26 together with the Philippines and Indonesia, and we're very pleased that we received strong support from Secretary Yellen. What is it? So it's a vehicle that has two main goals. The first is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the early retirement of coal, And the second is to facilitate new investments in renewable and sustainable energy sources. And we feel that this is a way to solve the problem of how to retire young coal-fired power plants. We think it has enormous potential to catalyze private investment and will be ultimately, hopefully, a game changer in the region. So what we're doing is, in the near term, we're looking at 5 to 7 pilots, and these will be across Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And what we're going to do is repurpose these plants, convert them to either renewable energy, or they'll be converted to alternative uses. Just to give a sense of perspective and scale, so if we retire 50% of these coal-fired power plants in these 3 countries over the next 10 to 15 years, we could cut 200 million tons of CO2 emissions a year, which is roughly the equivalent of taking about 61 million cars off the road. We're a development bank, so we don't just do financing, we do policy work, and it's important to recognize that the ETM will align with our ongoing work to support policy reforms and regulations that support a permanent shift to clean energy while also addressing energy needs and energy security. We will prioritize also a just transition that alleviates the potential environmental and socioeconomic impacts of the ETM for effective communities and individuals. We're also, in addition to the ETM, we're developing several other innovative solutions. We have established mechanisms for mobilizing private finance through blended finance vehicles, project preparation facilities, SDG bonds, and credit enhancement products, et cetera. So a real full array of options. So as I said, we're committed to supporting our developing member countries. We acting as Asia's climate bank, and we look forward to working with our partner governments, with the private sector, and with our other stakeholders to help achieve a just transition in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Leslie. Without further ado, Courtney Weatherby she's the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program over at Stimson Center. Yeah, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm really going to focus my comments on the sort of the challenges with the renewable energy transition. I think we've heard very clearly that there's an impetus to move forward with the clean energy transition, to transition away from fossil fuels. But as we know, many developing countries in the Indo-Pacific region are facing this dual challenge, not only of needing to transition the energy supply, but also to expand it. Electricity demand is rising very rapidly for countries in the region. I'm going to focus on ASEAN, both because of its centrality to the Indo-Pacific, as well as because electricity demand in ASEAN is rising at about 4% annually, which is nearly double that of most of the rest of the world. So these countries are all facing this dual challenge of needing to build out a massive amount of new power generation capacity and transmission infrastructure while also transitioning the type of power mix that they're basing their energy supply off of. And obviously the key priority for policymakers when they're doing energy plans is to ensure that they have reliable, affordable, and secure electricity. So this really provides sort of a challenging context. When you look to ASEAN, the ASEAN countries do have a shared target for renewable energy. They aim to get 23% of the electricity mix coming from renewable energy sources by the mid-2020s. Some countries are ahead on this target, but many countries in ASEAN are lacking. When you look at the previously published power development plans for most countries in the region, if you actually look at the power mix, it's expected to increase the role of fossil fuels rather than decrease it. This is something that is changing. Many of these countries regularly revise their power development plans, and I think over the last few years we've seen the political will coming through in commitments and pledges to work towards carbon neutrality that shows that there is an interest in transitioning to renewable energy. But that has yet to be reflected in many of these official targets and power development plans. Historically, the key reason for this was really price. When you talk to policymakers 5 years ago when many of these plans were being published, the price of electricity from renewable energy sources, particularly solar and wind, in Southeast Asia was still perceived to be relatively high. They hadn't seen some of the price drops that we've seen globally that have brought solar and wind and other alternative energy sources into competition with fossil fuels. That has drastically changed in recent years, in part due to support from the Asian Development Bank and other development partners with pilot projects to really show how these projects can work when you have the right financing and regulatory policies in place. And many of these countries have adjusted their targets, but that's not yet reflected in reality. There's still a number of sort of regulatory obstacles in place related to things like power purchase agreements, zoning regulations, and there's also a great deal of uncertainty on the part of utilities and national ministries of energy that are doing the planning about how certain they are that they can swiftly transition and integrate all of this variable renewable energy as an alternative to sort of fuel-driven hydropower or fossil fuel plants where they can turn things on and off as needed. So this really has caused a lot of uncertainty. And I think Vietnam is a great case study here where you look at the rollout that they've had with renewable energy. So Vietnam went from having almost no solar in its grid in 2017 to having more than 16,000 megawatts in its grid as of late 2021. That's about 20% of the total installed capacity. And it's obviously a success case in the sense of rolling out renewable energy and showing how swiftly things can move. But at the same time, there are major challenges with integrating all of this effectively. Vietnam, like many other developing countries, has somewhat underinvested in the transmission and distribution system. It wasn't ready to really integrate and manage these various sources of solar where they don't produce consistently because of the way that the plants work. And developed grids and utilities that have the capacity to integrate this, that's less of a problem even when you hit 20% of installed capacity. But it serves as somewhat of a bellwether for countries in the region where there really needs to be further development on the part of the utilities and the national governments to be able to accommodate these changes. So I think this provides an obvious opportunity for the United States and other development partners to continue not only supporting investment, but providing technical and capacity building on how to integrate this renewable energy. This is not necessarily a distant experience for us. We also have struggled with these challenges of integrating renewable energy and working through a lot of the kinks in this process. So I think there's a number of relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of capacity building and technical assistance that can be provided before we even get into sort of the physical infrastructure investment challenges, although obviously those are also very needed. So a few specific examples in this space could be, for instance, digitalization of the energy sector, improving the level of monitoring, improving load demand forecasting, improving weather forecasting as well. With additional resources and expertise in this area, it can be much easier to sort of adjust quickly and integrate solar and wind and other variable sources that are going to be the backbone of the future energy supply. At the same time, there's opportunities sort of in the energy efficiency space. You know, when you're looking at these rapid electricity demand growth in the region, whatever we can do to shave that will allow a little bit more flexibility and management on the part of the utilities and the power generators in the region to effectively ensure reliability for the system. So improving energy efficiency is another key opportunity here. And then obviously we're looking at also opportunities with future technologies that are just emerging, which we are rolling out and utilizing here in the United States, but which are still very early in pilot phases in the region. There are things like battery storage or other types of energy storage that can again help to alleviate some of these challenges in the transition away from sort of on-demand fuel-based electricity types to production that's coming from renewable energy sources. So I'm going to stop there so that we can get to our discussion.
Yeah. No, that was great. Thank you, Courtney. So, I think, as the region, we talked about how, there's still a lot of energy demand growth, et cetera. But, and as, the Undersecretary sort of highlighted, it's, in light of the war, that's really starting to push up the energy prices at the moment. And it's not just that it's going up, but it's also, it's a time when we're seeing a lot of volatility. For a region that really needs to be balancing not just decarbonization goal and not just the economic sort of security goal, but also trying to meet more energy access goal, that's not just quantitative, but also qualitative energy access issue. It's a very challenging time. And one of the concerns that I have is how, to some extent, how the European commitment to rapidly reduce reliance on Russian, natural gas is starting to, sort of, tighten the gas market more than even before the war, and it was already starting to be pretty tight. And we've seen some of the Indo-Pacific economies finding it too expensive to afford LNG. And some of them have then decided to turn back to more of a coal use, thermal coal consumption. And that's really one of the key downsides for the problems of or the challenges of what the region is trying to sort of navigate through. So I wanted to get just, I guess, thoughts from all three of you from sort of different perspectives. But first, to Undersecretary Fernandez, you've already talked about, like SPR, U.S. SPR use and et cetera. But, what are, some of the particular ways that the U.S. government can be helping the region navigate? That's, I guess, perhaps like unique to that region, as opposed to, I think, SPR has benefit to the entire world, if you will. If you could share that with us, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's one that we wrestle with a lot these days, obviously. Look, the first piece of good news is that U.S. LNG producers are stepping up. Our exports of LNG are at record levels. Just to give you a couple of one factoid. In February, over 50% of European imports of LNG were from the U.S. That's a huge shift. And I can tell you that in the last couple of weeks, I've talked to U.S. LNG producers. They think they can do more. It's going to take them a little bit of time to ramp up. And there are a number of European countries that actually have come to the U.S. and are on their way to Houston to try and see if they can secure more supplies. So one piece of the puzzle is, in the short term, U.S. LNG producers. In the longer term, certainly in Europe, the crisis is accelerating the shift to clean energy. And that was, and I can tell you from personal experience, having served on the company board that basically does renewable energy, in many parts of Europe, renewable energy is cheaper today than fossil fuel-based energy. And the harder part is Asia, and some of that is because of its dependence on coal. But I do think there are a couple of things that we can do. One is, the administration will announce our infrastructure initiative, B3W. You've heard about it. It's been in the works for a while. The IPEF also includes an energy piece. We are going to do all that we can to try and improve the infrastructure. And it's not just power plants. It's transmission lines. Mm-hmm. It's also the regulatory framework that makes it quite slow in many cases to do this. The last piece I would talk about is, I think, we're seeing already investments in India, for example. The Development Finance Corporation announced a $500 million loan to do that. So I think we are moving fast on the European side because of the crisis. But I think in the medium term, you'll see many more. Hopefully, you'll see many more developments on the Asian side, and that's going to be a harder nut to crack. But I think we are making progress. We have to do more.
Thank you. So, Leslie, from the ADB perspective, how does this period of sort of high and volatile energy market sort of affect the way you could really work with the regional partners in carrying out your mission and priorities?
Obviously, that's something we wonder about as well. I think in Asia, as I indicated, we have tremendous diversity of countries. You have some countries where that are facing balance of payment problems, and they have these high import costs. That's going to impact them tremendously. We have other countries, not in the Indo-Pacific region, but in Central Asia, which are part of our group of countries, who are going to benefit because they're net exporting. So it really depends on which country. But if we're looking at the Indo-Pacific region, I think you have to remain optimistic, and I think you also have to recognize that we have tremendous a number of tools at our disposal to support these efforts. We have very generous donors who are really helping us develop innovative tools to be able to mobilize private capital, get the investment in that's necessary to undertake this transition. We have policy loans, which also provide budgetary support, which can help alleviate some of the balance of payment issues that these countries are experiencing. You know, countries have their NDCs, they have their objectives, and the question is, how can we best support them in meeting those objectives? And I think, you know, we're seeing with the ETM, we're seeing a number of other vehicles, we're seeing that support continue, and also there's tremendous political will. Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, you know, there's a lot of political will to do this, and as long as you can support those efforts, I think it might be slower than we like, but I think it will happen.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Leslie. I think we are, let me invite, I'm sorry, I think we just have a couple minutes left from what according to the cue that I just got. But Cornyn, you know, if you could add some thoughts as to how we should be working with other countries, perhaps, or you know, non-U.S. partners in you know, making sure that the Indo-Pacific region can successfully navigate this dual or three the challenging environment. That would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just briefly comment on that, and I do think that obviously, as was discussed, this is really sort of a medium to long-term challenge for the Asia-Pacific. It's an acute crisis, but it's also a long-term crisis. And so staying the course on providing the technical assistance, the capacity building assistance, the technology transfers that are necessary, some of those things I mentioned before. But also I think there are real opportunities for further investment from the United States and partners in sort of flagship projects that can really show the effectiveness of some of these emerging technologies and really help build capacity locally. So there's been a long pull for further investment from the United States. I think this would be a great time as this infrastructure initiative rolls out for a flagship DFC project on renewable energy and effective electricity trade in ASEAN to help meet those goals. So, whether that's solar, obviously that's a little difficult, but there's a plethora of renewable energy technologies looking at wind, geothermal, modern biomass, things where the United States can effectively compete and pull on its own supply chains to support investment in this space.
Fantastic. It was a short but very rich conversation, and I can't be more thankful for the three excellent speakers. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And I'm sorry we didn't have a time to take your questions from the audience and also in the sort of online world, but please join me in thanking them.
Okay, folks, could you find your seats? We want to get started. Senator Cornyn has to leave at 9:45. He's got to vote, so we don't want to waste any time. I want to say a very sincere thank you to Senator Cornyn for joining us today. You know, I mean, we have a system in the Congress. We elect people from geographical regions. And most members of Congress just kind of focus on their home district or their home state. But there are a few senators that have a larger vision of their leadership in Washington, and that's John Cornyn. He has had a much larger vision of his leadership on behalf of all of us in the Congress for many years. We were just talking while we were waiting to get going here that his last time here at CSS was back in 2019, and it's like these last 2 years were just kind of a amnesia. It was like Rip Van Winkle, you know, we're waking up again, longer beards. But we are here to have a chance to listen to Senator Cornyn, who has had a strong and professional interest in Asia. He's been to Taiwan this year. I believe he's the co-chair of the India Caucus, and he's heading to Japan soon. So, you know, for a senator from Texas, you know, there aren't a lot of votes in going to Taiwan and going to Japan, but it's because the nation needs this leadership. And so we're grateful that he's here to share those insights with us today. With your warm applause, would you please welcome Senator John Cornyn?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hamre, for opening up the session. As Dr. Hamre said, we have a pretty short amount of time with the senator. And so I'm going to try to keep this brief. For those of you who were here yesterday, you know me. I'm Greg Poley, and I direct the Southeast Asia program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative here. And the way we're going to run this is I'm going to ask a few questions of the senator, and then we'd like to get some questions from the audience. Given how tight the timeline is, if you're online, you can type your questions as you have been throughout the event. If you're here in the room, we've put some papers on the chairs. We'd like you to write your questions during the first part of the session, and somebody will run them up here so we can get right into them. And so with that, Senator, I'd like to start with the role of Congress on U.S. Indo-Pacific policy. So it's become very popular around this building to say that Asia is one of the few bipartisan issues we clearly have up on the Hill. What are the contours of that bipartisan consensus these days, and what should we expect coming from Capitol Hill in the future as a result?
Well, obviously, Congress has the power of the purse, which is not insignificant. But as you know, most foreign policies run out of the executive branch. But there also needs to be, in addition to appropriations, the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committees, the Foreign Relations Committee, all have a pretty rich portfolio of national security and foreign affairs. And each of us sort of have a little different piece of it. But obviously we are, what happens here in America, including our security here, depends a lot on what happens in other parts of the world. So one of the benefits of being in the Senate, my predecessor, Phil Gramm, told me when I got to the Senate, he said, one of the best things about this job is your ability to travel and to go talk to the principals who are making decisions in other countries and to get to know people on a first-hand basis, and informs you how to do your job better. But it's you know, things like the caucuses that we've created, things like the US-India Caucus that Hillary Clinton and I founded in 2000, I think it was 4 or 5. I have a large Indian American constituency in Texas. About 500,000 Texans are Indian Americans. And we recently, well, it's been a few years ago now, had Prime Minister Modi there. And the name of the event in Houston, you'll appreciate, was Howdy Modi. And it was quite an affair, and he's quite a charismatic individual. But I think a lot of this depends on the individual members and their interests, but Texas is a pretty diverse place. And obviously I'm concerned about our national security, which I consider to be the most important part of the job.
You knew right where I was going to go with the next question. So you co-chair the India Caucus. What do you view as the role of the U.S.-India partnership in maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific? And also, if you have any thoughts on the role of the Quad going forward.
Well, I think India is a very important country to the United States, and I'm glad to see our relationship getting better all the time. The civilian nuclear deal that was done under the auspices of the George W. Bush administration was a very important development. India is a big country. They're a democracy. They were a former British colony. The rule of law is by and large observed there, unlike some other parts of the world, and so we have a lot in common. But as we've seen in the recent vote in the United Nations, where India abstained on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was quite a disappointment. Senator Warner, Mark Warner, who's chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and I, also a member of the Intelligence Committee, but in our role now as the co-chairs of the U.S.-India Caucus, did call the ambassador to express our disappointment at India's vote. We had a civil conversation, and there's a lot of history that goes along with this, and part of it is India's dependence on Russian weapons in order to defend itself historically, and something that we're trying to change gradually, but they want to be able to produce more of their self-defense equipment domestically. So it's a very important relationship. When I was on my recent trip in the Indo-Pacific, we did have a chance to visit with the Secretary of External Affairs, a very urbane and sophisticated gentleman. And I made the comment at lunch that we were concerned about Taiwan and what the PRC might do with Taiwan. He said, well, Senator, it's not just a Taiwan problem, it's a China problem, which to me spoke volumes about how they view the threat to their own country.
So you led a CODEL last November, which included India, but you also stopped in the Philippines, which is the oldest U.S. treaty ally in the region. I imagine you got an earful about the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea, as the Philippines calls it. There are few interests as longstanding in American foreign policy as defensive sea lanes and freedom of the seas. How should we be thinking about this component of a free and open Indo-Pacific?
Well, Senator Crapo, who's the ranking member on the Finance Committee, and Senator Tuberville and Senator Lee, we all went, along with two of our House colleagues, on the CODEL, short for Congressional Delegation. And we had I think Senator Crapo said we spent 55 hours in an airplane over 8 days. It was quite a trip, but very informative. But nowhere else, was it really kind of more eye-opening than going to Manila. We got on a P-8, which is a submarine hunter. It's about a 737 outfitted with a lot of gear, and we ended up flying in part of the South China Sea. And you get a little bit better perspective about the importance of that and the threat to the region, and not just Taiwan, but also the region, because there are a lot of contested islands, and in addition to China building its own islands out of reefs, there's a lot of contested islands. But their threat to international sea lanes and commerce and national security is real. That's why their whole approach is to gradually sort of wear everybody down, and we'll accept sort of the fait accompli. This kind of reminds me of the old story about the frog and the pot of water on the oven. As long as you don't turn it up real fast, the frog will jump out if you do. But if you don't, before you know it, the frog will actually be cooked. And I think a lot of the approach the PRC has used toward the region in trying to gain acceptance to what they would consider to be the fait accompli when it comes to the first and second island chain, I think is very concerning and been certainly a huge focus. They obviously need, since they import a lot of their energy, they also need access to those sea lanes too, but they need to figure out how to cooperate with international use of international waters. But right now they are just gradually trying to wear everybody down and force everybody in the region to accept sort of a fait accompli.
Well, Senator, I have to say I've been running our South China Sea work here for a long time, and that's one of the more cogent explanations of China's what we call gray zone coercion that I've ever heard. I hope you don't mind if I borrow some of it in my next step.
Please.
Let's turn back to Taiwan, which you mentioned. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine has a lot of serious folks in town thinking more seriously about similar contingencies in Taiwan. Do you think we're doing enough, or are our allies doing enough to build Taiwanese resiliency and deter Chinese aggression?
No, I don't. You know, President Xi has made it clear that he does intend to take Taiwan. There's a timeline that people have talked about. I think 2027 is sort of the timeline, but you know, there's no rule or law that says he has to wait. But I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a big eye-opening experience for President Xi, and I think changed that dynamic a little bit. Hopefully it's changed our understanding of the threat that would mean both to our economy and our national security if President Xi did move on Taiwan. But I think you know, one of the things we've talked about is that COVID did is expose our supply chains, and whether it's personal protective equipment. I still remember the first call I had with Governor Abbott. I said, what do you need when COVID hit? And he said, well, I need testing and I need PPE. And I said, well, what's PPE? And he said, oh, you know, masks and gowns. I said, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I get it. Personal protective equipment. It's all made in China. And we can't get it because they have a need for it there because that's the origins of the virus. So, you know, we went from there to then realize that 90% of the semiconductors in the world are made in Asia, including about 60% of the most advanced semiconductors in the world being made in Taiwan Semiconductor in Taipei. So on our trip, we visited the Taiwan Semiconductor company, and they've got a great business model. They can build semiconductors for about 30% less than you could if you manufactured them here in America. So what they do is companies will design the semiconductor chips they need, and then they will make them for them. So it's a great business model. They're booming. But can you imagine if 60% of the semiconductors that run everything from, you know, your cell phone to a F-35 Joint Strike Fighter were blockaded during another pandemic, a natural disaster, or you know, military conflict, what that would mean to our economy. So that's the reason why Senator Warner, again, is my colleague and partner on the CHIPS Act, to try to bring back our capacity to build those semiconductors here in America to eliminate that vulnerability. And I know people are interested in where all that stands. USICA, it's got several different names. I think we started out with Endless Frontiers, and now it's like called Made in America. We'll probably name it something else before we're done. But we're going to a formal conference committee, which is something we haven't done in a long time. But I'm still optimistic that we will get it done, although it sure has taken a long time. But it's a huge vulnerability, and we just can't leave that vulnerability there.
Well, thank you. You're doing an excellent job of anticipating my questions before I get to them. So I think this is going to be the last question that I'm going to ask. Everybody's being a little bit shy this morning. So again, I would encourage you, if you're online, to go ahead and type questions in online, and we'll run up questions that were written in the audience on paper. So let's turn to trade. You co-chair the Subcommittee on International Trade. Last year, you penned an op-ed in the Washington Post arguing that the United States should rejoin the CPTPP, the successor to TPP. Right. Do you view the administration's current Indo-Pacific economic framework as a step in the right direction on that road? And could a more robust trade package, a trade agreement, actually get through the U.S. Congress at this point?
Well, I've come to believe that our refusal to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a big mistake. And what we're seeing, you mentioned the Quad earlier, we're seeing United States, Japan, Australia, India join in security organizations. But frankly, for me, the point is we have something that the People's Republic of China will never have, and that's friends and allies. And we need to work together in our mutual defense and for our mutual benefit in national security and trade. So I would like to be optimistic about the prospects for us joining what is now, I think it's called the CTPPP, whatever the name is now. But the fact of the matter is that the administration has not shown much enthusiasm for Trade Promotion Authority, which is now expired. And so absent that, I think the obstacles are pretty high. Organized labor has always been fairly skeptical of these trade agreements, as they were during the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And Senator Wyden, who's chairman of the Finance Committee now, and Sherrod Brown were able to get things that sort of satisfied that part of their constituency. I still believe it's very important for us to continue to build those ties in the region, not just from a security standpoint, but from an economic standpoint as well. And that's, to me, the best way to check China's march toward consolidating their power in both economic and military in the region.
So we're still waiting for some questions to come in. So let me make myself a liar and ask one more quick follow-up. The next session after this will be with Commerce, and I should let everybody know that Secretary Gina Raimondo is feeling ill, so we'll have a stand-in. Deputy Assistant Secretary Pam Fan has agreed to come on. But before Commerce has to take any lumps over IPEF, I wonder if I could ask a quick follow-up. So USTR Catherine Tai was on the Hill last week, testified. How do you feel about the current IPEF as you understand the framework? What do you think the consensus is on the Hill, if there is one, on the framework?
I think it's viewed as sort of a weak substitute for the real thing. As I said, I think the administration's reluctance to enter into new trade agreements, this is sort of being offered up as an alternative, but it's not. I don't think it's not what I would hope for in terms of getting new trade agreements.
Thank you. So we do have a question. It's one that you sort of already answered, but let's ask it and see if we can put you under a little pressure, I suppose. Many of the U.S.'s Asian partners are expressing frustration with IPEF, as you noted, because it lacks market access and tariff reductions. Would this U.S. Congress be able to pass a more robust U.S.-Asia free trade agreement?
Well, we've talked about that a little bit, and I think Texas, which I represent, all 29 million of us, we're big exporters of our agricultural products and everything else, and so I believe that having markets to sell more of what we make and grow in Texas and in America is a good thing in terms of our economy and job creation. And someone once observed that countries that trade together rarely go to war against each other. So it actually has a lot of other benefits too. So, but unfortunately, I don't see any momentum now. Senator Carper, who you mentioned a moment ago, who's the chair of the trade subcommittee that I'm the ranking member on, we sort of trade positions depending on who's in the majority. He's been terrific on this. And as you point out, we've written an op-ed, several op-eds to try to encourage development of free trade agreements or some alternative or some vision of the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the like. But frankly, I don't see much interest in the administration.
Here we are. We have one more. Senator, do you have any thoughts on President Biden's support for U.S. LNG to improve global energy security? What impact do you expect on domestic policy implementation?
Well, I was thinking earlier today of events in my life that sort of hit the reset button, and certainly the invasion of Ukraine was one of those. In terms of the reaction of our NATO partners, I was in Poland and Germany with Senator Ernst and a bipartisan group of senators recently. The huge refugee crisis. Germany has turned on a dime, as you know, in terms of their contributions to NATO, their willingness to meet their obligations for mutual defense there, but also the realization that these countries have been lulled into dependency on Russia for their energy supply and the difficulty that presents. I think it was 2017, the United States became a net energy exporter, And unfortunately, because of the debate over climate change and fossil fuels and transitioning to renewables, all of that has been, pretty vigorous, but it really has omitted one of the most important parts of that discussion, which is energy security. And unfortunately for Europe and other places, we're not going to be able to turn on a dime. You can't build the pipelines, you can't build the LNG import terminals and the like to build that infrastructure. But as my friend, since departed, John McCain, liked to talk about Russia, he said it was a gas station masquerading as a country. And this is really critical to Putin's and Russia's economy. And we have decided not to import any more Russian oil and gas, but some of our friends and allies in Europe have no alternative. So that's part of what I think we need to turn to try to figure ways to help them. And obviously, we're a huge energy exporter here in America. I think the Permian Basin in Texas produces 5 million barrels of oil a day. And we consume about 11 million in the United States, but we have that capacity. So I would hope that part of this discussion over climate, over energy, transitioning to green energy and the like could also include a rational discussion about energy security, because I think some people have an overly ambitious idea about how soon we can transition to purely fossil fuels. Even Germany's rethinking the shuttering of their nuclear power plants, which of course Europe was very high on, but had sort of decided after Fukushima that they would try to go strictly with renewables, which is not currently possible. So I hope this prompts a very serious discussion, and I hope CSIS will help us get the kind of expertise that the policymakers need to make good decisions in that area.
Well, thank you. And the panel just before this one tried to make an initial start at that, moderated by my colleague Jay Nakano and the great work that her team in the energy program is doing. We've got a quick follow-up here from the online audience. As we consider carbon accounting in our energy supply chain, beyond well-known methane leakage in oil and gas, are we also accounting for the carbon footprint in mining activities required to produce solar panels and wind turbines?
Well, we've all become, as I said, as part of the climate discussion, interested in ways to reduce emissions, and carbon capture and sequestration and that sort of technology, which is very expensive, is something that we need to continue to support in order to address concerns about carbon. Again, I think some people have an overly optimistic view about how fast we can do that or what it will take to do that. Our energy supply has always been in transition, and even back at the turn of the 19th century when, we had horse-drawn carriages and transportation. Can you imagine the environmental disaster that was when, with just all the manure, horse manure that piled up in cities and all the rats and everything else? Well, one of my favorite stories is, I think it's in the book Super Freakonomics by some Chicago economists. They talk about, almost overnight that went away. And they said, well, and they explained, well, it was the invention of the internal combustion engine. And so I just make that point to say, I think we should focus our efforts on research and development and innovation to answer a lot of these problems for us. There's nobody better in the world than the United States when it comes to innovation, and we just need to find ways to hasten the transition, but also to realistically understand that where we are now, because I think the Energy Information Administration says that by 2050, 75% of our energy supply will still be fossil fuels. So, but we can look at other alternatives, hydrogen, nuclear. There's a lot of great ideas out there, but they're not quite ready for prime time yet.
Thanks. We have another question online, bringing the conversation back to the CHIPS Act. In addition to support for the U.S. semiconductor industry, what other policy measures should we be taking to improve U.S. competitiveness?
Well, again, part of the work that Senator Warner and I and the Intelligence Committee are doing is looking at what our competitors are doing in terms of everything from 5G to quantum computing to artificial intelligence and beyond. And obviously the People's Republic of China is making huge investments there because they want to, frankly, leave us in their dust when it comes to developing these technologies and becoming the world's leader. I think that's always been our strength, but we need to find ways to encourage private investment. The government, I think, can play some role, as we are in the semiconductor space. This is a little bit of an adjustment for people like me that are sort of free market conservatives, but I think absolutely critical, as I've explained, to our economy and our national security. So there are probably going to be some other areas where we're going to have to look at, where we have vulnerabilities in terms of our supply chains and the like. There is, I think, a role for government to play, but not a dominant role, because the worst thing we could do for innovation in America is everything to be run out of Washington, D.C. by the U.S. government. So we need to give the private sector the encouragement, the incentives, and stand back if we can.
Thank you. We're going to do that rarest of thing in Washington, D.C. We're going to end a session right on time. So please join me in thanking Senator Cornyn for his time this morning.
Thank you.
soon as she comes in, we're ready to mic her.
Thank you.
How you feeling?
Fine. I mean, it would have been cool to have her come up here. So, but I'm going to mask my disappointment because that's not fair. Pam's stepping in. She's great. She gives our full respect. I had to step in for the boss one times. I think it's the difference between the Chinese approach and hopefully the U.S. approach on a lot of these things.
Slowly turning up the temperature, people don't realize that they're in danger. They're becoming
I left my card at home.
Because this is updated, I updated my profile, so.
What do you work on here?
Also, so I specialize on US relations. Oh, but maybe you want to take a picture and then. Yeah, I'll do that.
no. Okay. Do you want to? I have. You over here? But I can see what.
No, this is fine. And this is my name here, my last name is Shelby, so what picture.
How do you do that?
Oh, I think you go to your camera and then you scan the code and it will link you to my profile.
We're just amazed how she's doing this.
Yeah, showing my QR code instead of.
Yeah, you too, Bill.
I wonder what we have. Oh, it sounds like we're on. Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everybody, once again. Good morning to those who are, or good evening, or whatever time of day it is to those who are online. It's a great pleasure to be able to sit down with Pamela Fan, someone whom I've gotten to know over the last few months, who's the Commerce Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia. She is doing a hard thing, which is stepping in for the boss at the last minute, and we're really grateful, truly grateful that you would do that. She's responsible for developing programs, policies, and strategies at Commerce to strengthen the U.S. commercial position in Asia. She's a career civil servant who spent nearly a decade at the Department of State before joining Commerce, and in her current role, Pamela oversees over 200 employees across 16 markets in Asia and in Washington, D.C., promoting U.S. exports, especially among small and medium-sized enterprises, advancing and protecting U.S. commercial interests overseas, and attracting inward investments into the United States. And I love it that she taught law, not only at Stanford Law School, but also at Georgetown Law School, so you know we're dealing with a formidable intellect. So please join me in welcoming Pamela Phan. So if it's okay with you, I'll jump right in with some questions.
That sounds great. And, you know, the Secretary sends her regrets. She really wanted to participate this morning. She recognizes how important this conversation is. And so, you know, we made it a priority to be here and to provide the commerce perspective.
Thank you. I think it's really important. We've heard from Ambassador Bianchi, we've heard from the White House, we've heard from State. It's really important to hear the commerce perspective, and thank you for bringing it. Yeah. Secretary had I think, phenomenally successful trip to Asia in November. She went to Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia. We just had a very good visit with Prime Minister Lee of Singapore this past week. When you look at that trip and this recent visit, what are your top takeaways? What do you see as the biggest successes?
Sure. It has been gangbusters for us since November of last year when she traveled out there. I actually arrived at Commerce the week after her trip. It was a very productive trip, and what was important you know, were conversations that she had that really focused on ASEAN centrality and the importance of re-engaging in the region, but specifically re-engaging with the ASEAN countries as well. You know, we have been planning for a US-ASEAN Special Summit, and that is still very much in the works and something that we're hoping will be on the calendar in another couple months. But that's going to be a key piece to advancing that relationship. You know, she had some good conversations when she was out there. She was not only in Malaysia and Singapore and Japan, but she had the opportunity to meet with counterparts in Australia and New Zealand in Singapore when she was there. And you know, there was a lot of discussion about how we can all work together to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic and to address a whole set of global economic challenges that are facing the world today. That trip allowed her to talk to her counterparts about the President's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And so it was an opportunity to sit down and to engage with the counterparts from all 5 countries on that and on what we are envisioning. I think at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore, and then through her initial conversations with counterparts, that's where she was able to get some initial feedback on this concept and the importance of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for centering our relationships in the region. We also were able to advance our bilateral relationship with Singapore. In October, the Secretary had launched with the Singaporeans this new U.S.-Singapore Partnership for Growth and Innovation, or the PGI, as we call it. And so she and Minister Gan have been working very hard on that. And when Prime Minister Lee was in town last week, she participated in that conversation with the President. She also had a bilat with Minister of Trade Gan, as well as Minister of Communications and Information Teo, about the PGI. And no surprise, we're focusing on a couple key administration priorities in the PGI. Those include the digital economy, clean energy and environmental technology, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, and then some cross-cutting issues that include standards and supply chain resilience. So we're looking to take forward our work in the PGI now with some concrete work areas, including engaging with the Singaporeans in artificial intelligence standards and governance frameworks. We're also looking at an advanced manufacturing trade mission that will go out to the region and that will hit not only Singapore and Indonesia, but also Japan in October. And then finally, there's quite a bit of discussion through the PGI on cybersecurity best practices, and we're engaging with the ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. So a lot going on and a lot coming out of that trip in November.
Well, that's terrific. We had a chance to meet with Minister Gan with some of our members last week. He talked about his conversations with Gina.
Yeah.
He very much values the relationship. The Singaporeans are very serious about moving as quickly as possible in the PGI.
Yeah.
And I guess there's an assumption that Singapore will be a central player in the Indo-Pacific economic framework. But can you tell us a little bit more about what the status is now, what countries you're talking with, what the level of interest is that you're hearing? We heard a little bit about that from Ambassador Bianchi yesterday, but we'd love to hear from the Commerce perspective.
Sure. Those early conversations in November provided an opportunity to engage with a certain subset of countries. And so she has been involved in conversations with Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand from those early days. This is really going to anchor our economic efforts in the region. It is being seen as a central part, more generally, of our Indo-Pacific strategy. And so we're taking it seriously. We recognize how fast-growing and how commercially and strategically important the region is. My portfolio spans the continent, basically from Pakistan in the west all the way over to the Pacific Islands in the east. The only parts that I'm not responsible for are the PRC, Macau, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. But we are engaging broadly across that entire geographic region. And what's important here is to really think about competitiveness in this new age. As we move forward in this new economy, that competitiveness it's really going to be defined by how well all of our economies are going to be able to harness technology and to participate in the digital economy, to adapt to these coming energy and climate challenges that we're all facing. And really to do so in a manner that involves broad, inclusive growth. And so we recognize that this is not a conversation that we should be having only with the usual suspects, our like-mindeds, and that it is critical to reach out more broadly in the interest of inclusiveness. And the ASEANs are such an important piece of that. So we've had some conversations with the ASEANs. I think that this is a new, novel concept. It's not your traditional free trade agreement. And so a lot of questions come up about what this looks like then and what we're striving for here. So there has been a lot of engagement on that front. We are hopeful that in the next month or so, we should be in a position to potentially launch, and to launch with more than just a handful of countries. The team is working very hard, and the Secretary herself is personally engaged in regular conversations with counterparts.
That's great to hear. I know there's a constant tension between highest possible standards and maximum inclusivity.
Yeah.
In that regard, you mentioned the possibility of a summit. Presumably the summit will be quite inclusive. When that happens, is that an opportunity for you to stress inclusivity?
It has been a conversation that we have had with certain ASEAN countries. And I think, the specific question that has come up is, will the special summit be a venue for potentially announcing the launch? Right now, there are a lot of conversations that are going into that. Obviously, the ASEANs include everybody from Cambodia, which is chairing, to Myanmar, where there are some significant political issues right now. And so whether or not we leverage that particular forum and the ASEAN Summit, and whether that makes sense, given the partners that we are engaging with for the purposes of IPEF, I think that's still very much a topic of conversation. And, you know, there are pros and cons, arguments on either side, but it's something that we've been deliberating on.
Well, our two institutions, CSIS and US-ASEAN Business Council, are happy to help when the time comes. We look forward to a date, and we'll do all we can to make sure it's as successful as possible.
Yeah, I have no fear. I'm sure we will be in touch.
Good, good. We had a really interesting introduction this morning by Dr. Hamre, the president of CSIS, and he talked about supply chain resilience and the challenges to the supply chain, and that has been a feature of Secretary Raimondo's leadership of commerce, is that focus on supply chains. Can you tell us a little bit about what commerce is doing to enhance supply chain resilience with regard to our Asian partners?
Thank you for that question. I think it's not just the COVID-19 pandemic. It has also been the events in Ukraine from the past several weeks, month plus, that have really underscored vulnerabilities that exist in the supply chain. And, you know, the supply chain in a number of sectors. And so the Commerce Department, under the Secretary's leadership, has been working on supply chain resilience issues for quite some time now. And you know, there's a lot of analysis, a lot of conversation ongoing internally to try and develop recommendations responsive to the President's executive order on America's supply chains. And so we've been looking into that. We have been engaging with countries on everything from the supply chain issues in semiconductors, for example, to critical minerals, you know, solar, pharmaceuticals, much in line with what the President has been focusing on in that executive order. Obviously, it's not just the U.S. government and commerce that has a role to play. This is where it has been critically important for us to talk to industry, to talk to stakeholders, and to talk to these countries about what they're seeing, what the challenges are, and where, you know, where solutions can be found. And so we're really focusing on trying to strengthen all of those partnerships and to engage with our industry stakeholders, with foreign governments, with other domestic and international partners in this space for the purposes of building resiliency and also security. I think we have often talked about 4 key areas that we are focused on when it comes to supply chain resilience, and those areas are transparency, security, diversity, and also sustainability. And so part of the conversation with stakeholders and others is really a conversation about how we can achieve those 4 things in our supply chain work. And this has really impacted our bilateral dialogues as well. In many of our key bilateral dialogues in the region, we have built in a supply chain resilience component. And so when we sit and we talk about these issues with the Malaysians, for example, we are looking ahead at a potential memorandum of cooperation that will build in work on supply chain resilience. You know, Malaysia's Minister Azman Ali is coming in May, and we are hopeful that we will have made enough progress so that we can get a memorandum of cooperation on this issue on the table and potentially signed. I make no promises, but the team is certainly working hard towards that potential goal.
Great. Well, our members are watching that with great interest. We had Senator Cornyn spoke just a little bit earlier, and he kind of brought home the significance when he talked about 60% of the world's microprocessors coming from one island, and the need to make sure that diversity and resiliency are built into supply chains, not just for chips, but for all of the ingredients that industry needs to keep moving forward?
Yeah, the Secretary had a great conversation last week with the Australians, actually. We held a critical minerals CEO roundtable. And while there is a lot of production and mining that takes place in Australia, a key concern is processing capability. And right now, almost all processing takes place either in the PRC or in Malaysia. And, you know, that is a significant vulnerability for everybody, including, you know, end users scattered all across the globe. And so as she's having these conversations, she recognizes how critical it is to look at the potential opportunities to build out this area and to allow for greater diversification.
Great, thank you. Climate, another priority for Secretary, for Commerce, for the President. The clean energy transition is underway here, it's underway in Asia. Yeah. What is it that Commerce is able to do to contribute to boost that, speed it up?
Sure.
Speed up that transition.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we are looking at conversations about infrastructure, decarbonization, and clean energy as a key focal area. You know, the more inclusive we can be with IPEF, the more countries in the region we can engage on these issues. They all have very ambitious COP26 aims, commitments, and, you know, figuring out how to leverage that interest and that level of ambition, and how to think about potential public-private partnerships, technical assistance, you know, feasibility studies on the ground, areas where we can all come together to really leverage these opportunities for the benefit of these countries is kind of task number one. But we're obviously also doing a lot of thinking with respect to the President's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And we recognize that in addition to helping combat climate change, there is also the opportunity to create potentially millions of well-paying jobs here in the United States through these efforts. And so, you know, right now there's a lot of discussion, a lot of planning going on internally to figure out how we can best enhance our support for U.S. clean tech exporters. And, you know, there the dual goals are really to support our trade partners' efforts to meet their greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, but also to promote U.S. exports, the export of goods and services to the region to advance all of these goals. We have several lines of effort that help us carry through on this aim. First and foremost, our trade missions. I'm happy to be able to share that the Undersecretary for International Trade, Marisa Lago, will be leading a clean energy trade mission to Southeast Asia with stops in Jakarta, Indonesia, as well as Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and then an optional third country in the form of the Philippines. That trade mission is taking place from June 6th through June 13th, I believe it is, and we have a Federal Register notice out that solicits interest from companies that might have goods and services that feed into this. The deadline on that Federal Register notice is actually today. And so this is timely and a good opportunity for me to mention this to this audience in particular. We also are, of course, enhancing our outreach to U.S. clean tech companies and our advocacy for companies that are looking to pursue opportunities abroad in these various countries. We're increasing the role that the International Trade Administration is playing when it comes to establishing clean tech international standards, standards development and intellectual property protection. And then we're also looking to attract foreign direct investment here in the United States so that we can grow our domestic clean tech industrial base. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, with a lot of our bilateral dialogues and initiatives, we're looking to align the conversation in those with these priorities. And so similar to supply chain resilience being a core focus of a lot of these initiatives, clean energy decarbonization is a key component of what we're discussing in the bilateral dialogues as well. We've had great success in fiscal year 22 already. We have seen our stakeholder outreach increase in events to U.S. clean tech companies, for events that include U.S. clean tech companies in particular. This is an increase of about 40% over our fiscal year 21 numbers, and so we are increasingly active in this space and focused on this space. And then the last thing I'll say is that we have the National Export Strategy. It has been a number of years since the Commerce Department issued one, but we are looking at that afresh through our Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee, which the Secretary chairs. And this year, as we're looking at how to prioritize, clean tech competitiveness will likely be a critical component of our national export strategy. And so in the weeks and months ahead, when we're ready to announce that, I think that everyone will be able to see how that's incorporated into the planning. Overall, we stand ready to really work with partners in the region to achieve their net zero goals. And so, as you can tell, there's a lot of thought that's being put into it.
That's great. This begs a follow-up question. You mentioned Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines as destination for this upcoming trade mission. Those are three countries where the transition from coal to renewables won't be smooth. It will require some interim steps.
Yeah.
Is there a role for LNG?
That is a good question. We recognize how hard it is to go to net zero without having more of a glide path. And these are conversations that we're having bilaterally. We expect to have these conversations also in the context of our IPEF, our framework discussions. The administration has been developing for the past year, a strategy for international engagement, and has been talking about what the approach is on LNG. And in certain circumstances where it makes sense, that is a part of the conversation and something that is being considered. But I think obviously the goal is still net zero, and where we can push beyond that, I think we're trying to do so as well.
Great. One more? Time for one more? Okay. Data flows. A lot of our members in particular are keenly interested in an inclusive and a competitive digital economy where data flows across borders are written into the rules of engagement and the rules of trade. Commerce recently announced the Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework. When it comes to transferring data to and from the EU. What about facilitating data flows between and with our partners in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a critical issue. It was a critical issue when I was at the State Department and we were negotiating bilateral investment treaties and the investment chapters of free trade agreements. We recognize that in some of the countries that we're engaging with in the region, there are some issues there. There is a premium placed on security and arguments about privacy that we may not entirely see eye to eye on. When it comes to data flows, what's really critical there is trust. And a key element of trust is how businesses are able to process and access personal data. And so I've seen from India to Vietnam and elsewhere throughout the Indo-Pacific region, significant variance in the way that these countries are approaching their data policies and their laws. And some countries implementing measures that do restrict the flow of data beyond their borders and do require localization in the form of physical servers within their borders. And I think one thing that we're trying to think through with these countries is how to develop more innovative structures to allow us to bridge these regulatory differences. Our emphasis has been on how important it is to establish that trust so that we can ensure competitiveness and transparency and accountability. And so a key initiative of ours has been the expansion of the Apec cross-border privacy rules system, or CBPR. It's been originally developed in the Apec context, but what we're really looking towards, and what we've been working since 2020 on, together with the 8 other APEC member economies, is how to expand what we're trying to achieve through the CBPR beyond APEC. We are hopeful that in the weeks ahead, later this month actually, we will be able to get to a public global CBPR declaration. And the goal there is to really ensure that that CBPR, that system, can really serve as a global privacy mechanism, and that we're able to scale the benefits that we've been able to achieve in APEC more broadly to the benefit of companies and consumers and governments as well, and to really allow for interoperability. I am certainly not the expert in this area, but having been a part of conversations about this as we're engaging with IPEF partners, what's clear is that a key feature of the CBPR system is accountability. And what we're looking to achieve is to have companies that are participating have them have their privacy policies and practices verified by a third party. And so that comes back to the issue of trust. All of the commitments under the CBPR system, they are going to be made enforceable by government authorities, and they're going to be supported by a multilateral arrangement to collaborate on enforcement across jurisdictions. And so the goal here is to promote interoperability. We're not requiring all domestic approaches to be the same, but we are looking at interoperability and establishing at least some privacy baselines. So.
Thank you. It's not just the big IT companies and the big financial service companies that have a huge stake in this and setting the rules on data. It's small, medium-sized enterprises. 270,000 of them in the United States. That they go online, they'll succeed and recover from the effects of COVID. And then in Southeast Asia, as Karan Bhatia mentioned yesterday, Southeast Asia is headed for a $1 trillion digital economy by 2030. Yeah. And the number of small companies that have come online during COVID, staying online. Karan mentioned 40 million new internet users in Southeast Asia alone last year. So the opportunities are enormous, and the effects are on the little guy as well as the big guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been amazing to see the digital transformation providing opportunities in this pandemic environment in particular. Yes. This administration and the secretary are really focused on how we can reach out to and enable greater access for small and medium-sized enterprises here in our own country. And so, again, no surprise that we are using IPEF to focus on the issues that we are focusing on in some of these discussions, especially about the digital transformation that these countries are seeing, how that those benefits can accrue to not just the SMEs, but even the micro businesses. That's been a really fascinating part of the conversation and an important part of the conversation as well.
Well, thanks. Please consider us your partners in that endeavor. And I think, yep, I'm getting the nod. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for jumping in, both feet at the last minute. Really grateful to you. And hope we can continue the conversation.
Well, thank you to you and to USABC and to CSIS for having me here today. It's hard to be a stand-in for our secretary. She's such a powerhouse, but I'm glad to be able to delve into some of the substance, and certainly welcome continued collaboration on these important issues.
Thanks. Thanks for your leadership.
That's on.
So I'll be here. Why don't we just fill it in panel order then? Yeah, we could do it in panel order. Why don't we? The stage mic's a little close. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging in there. We are almost at the end of our first live, real, in-person two-day conference. And I'm pretty happy. We've made it. We were the guinea pigs for this hybrid conferencing that is our new normal, I suppose. So far, most of the conversation has been around issues of economics, development, public health, and now we're going to talk about all of the messy stuff, the politics, the geopolitics, the strategy, which is why we've framed this panel as being ASEAN and the Quad in the free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think what we're trying to get at here is this tension that I think we're trying to paint as complementary, and maybe it is, but there's clearly a rhetorical tension here between longstanding commitment by the U.S. and allies to ASEAN centrality and all of these new acronyms we're getting, Quad and AUKUS and whatnot. And so we're going to hear from three great panelists today. I'll try to keep my role as moderator limited to just maybe asking a follow-up question or two, and then turn to the audience just like we have so far. So first we're going to hear from Paul Myler, Ambassador Paul Myler, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy to Australia, just across the street there. Then we'll hear from my good friend Alina Noor, who is the Director for Political and Security Affairs. Is that right? Is it political security? Yeah. Okay. At the Asia Society Policy Institute. Also going to be my co-host on a newly launched podcast next week called Southeast Asia Radio. So you should all tune in next Thursday for the first episode. And finally, my other friend Zach Cooper down there, who's over at the American Enterprise Institute and the German Marshall Fund, and has his own fancy podcast at War on the Rocks called Net Assessment, which you can listen to if you finish our podcast on Thursday. And so with that, why don't I turn over to Paul first? Paul, you don't have a podcast, do you?
I don't have a podcast.
Paul's working on a podcast. Let's start over here.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for convening us. It's great to be back in person. I haven't quite got used to the fact that I don't have my script up on one screen next to my webcam and everything else. So, we'll see how we go here. I'll just make some opening comments in terms of Australia and the Indo-Pacific. The fortunes of Australia and Australians have been inextricably linked to the Indo-Pacific, and successive Australian governments have sought to anchor our foreign policy in our region. The reasons and rationale for that have changed over time, but the centrality and persistence of our focus hasn't. We were the first country to be invited to become a dialogue partner for ASEAN in 1974, and nearly 50 years later, in 2021, we became the first country to agree a comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN. We've invested $154 million in our partnership with ASEAN to address COVID recovery, support implementation of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, on top of a landmark $500 million package of new economic development security measures in Southeast Asia. We've reinvigorated the Quad partnership, as you mentioned, with a positive practical agenda to support an open and inclusive and resilient Indo-Pacific. And, people have seen our cooperation in delivering vaccines, setting standards for critical and emerging tech, enhancing clean energy innovation, boosting supply chain resilience. I think the reality, as you pointed to, the world has entered a period of profound strategic challenge and disruption, with a lot of pressure on rules, norms and institutions. Last month, Quad leaders met to discuss the conflict in Ukraine and assess its implications for regional stability in the Indo-Pacific. Leaders were united in their collective commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific where smaller states do not need to live in fear of more powerful ones. I think the meeting, or we hope the meeting, sent a powerful signal to our region and to the world that the Quad stands together to uphold the values and principles of our rules-based international order. Of course, Quad partners recognise that the onus is on us to deliver and to build the region's trust in the grouping. Turning to ASEAN and its role in the Indo-Pacific, from a necessarily Australian perspective. Since World War II, obviously we've seen and been part of a remarkable transformation in our region, characterised by optimism, prosperity and openness. ASEAN sits at the heart of the region's architecture. Its habits of cooperation have earned it the role of convener for the wider Indo-Pacific, and we don't see any challenge to that. Like Australia, our Southeast Asian partners are grappling with the impacts of geostrategic competition and seeking a settling point in that competition that does not diminish their voice or their agency in the region. We all find strategic competition uncomfortable. But in Australia's view, it's vital we compete to preserve the liberal international order that has underpinned decades of stability and prosperity in the region. ASEAN countries are also navigating the changing dynamics in their own bilateral relationships, managing a more assertive China and looking to build positive connections with the Biden administration. And we certainly, against this backdrop, are supporting regional engagement, additional like-minded engagement, bringing in partners from Europe and the like to support a stable and prosperous neighbourhood we need. The Australian Prime Minister put it quite well, I think, recently. Australia supports ASEAN centrality, but also ASEAN cohesion and ASEAN agency. Our support for the East Asian Summit, for ASEAN's own outlook on the Indo-Pacific and our new comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN are evidence of our commitment to enhance regional dialogue grounded in ASEAN centrality. We're also ensuring our work in other forums, such as the Quad, sends a positive signal to ASEAN countries of our support for an open, sovereign, inclusive, resilient region, as well as our commitment to delivering practical cooperation. We continue to advocate for like-minded partners to strengthen their engagement in the region. Obviously, the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy aligns really well with Australia's priorities and vision for the region, and recognises both the importance of partnerships and the importance of centrality of ASEAN in realising that outcome. And we're certainly keen to work closely with them on operationalising the Indo-Pacific strategy and on crystallising the Indo-Pacific economic framework. I might just leave it there, and I can be a bit more provocative in question and answer if people have some.
Thank you. That's the promise. Alina, let me turn to you. Paul says that ASEAN is still central and has agency and is cohesive. What do you think?
Wait a minute. I said our objectives were for ASEAN to be central, have agency, and be cohesive.
Here's where the provocative bit comes in, right? Well, thanks, Greg, and CSIS and USABC for having me on this panel. I think I'm also trying to get used to being in a hybrid panel, and so if I'm looking down at my phone, it's because I'm looking at my notes, not because I'm looking at messages or anything else. But let me perhaps offer 3 thoughts to kick off. I'm going to zoom out a little with my first thought and suggest that although Southeast Asia is starting to open up to international travel, international business, the focus is still very much on COVID and COVID-related economic recovery. And I think those of us who sit in Washington and in the United States often forget that there's still a pandemic around the world. And not everyone has recovered at the same speed that we have in the United States. And those of us who've traveled to Southeast Asia very recently, I think, is reminded of this very starkly with all the mask using, even out in public in the open air, some distancing maybe, but definitely a very different landscape to what we're used to here. And I say this because even while we occupy ourselves with thoughts of grand strategery and competition and rivalry and all that, the realities on the ground are really quite different in Southeast Asia, certainly for the governments and capitals of Southeast Asia, but even more so for the people of Southeast Asia. And we all know politics is local, as we in the United States here gear up for congressional elections in November. And the very different realities on the ground obviously affect government capacity and they affect government priorities as well. So that's something to bear in mind as we think about re-engaging with the rest of the world, whether you're sitting in Washington or in Hanoi or Putrajaya or Singapore. The second point I would make is that I think Southeast Asia is very heartened by assurances of ASEAN centrality, unity and agency, all these good, positive feelings that Paul mentioned. It's something that we in Southeast Asia also like to affirm to ourselves. Now, what we haven't quite worked out in Southeast Asia is what all of those things mean in practice. And I think the manifestation of these plurilaterals, smaller arrangements, minilaterals and all that, like the Quad, like AUKUS, have obviously given some concern to some capitals in Southeast Asia. But I think the assurances that have been made are still very welcomed, particularly with the crisis going on in Myanmar now. I think it's very much appreciated in Southeast Asia that other countries have sort of given the leadership role to ASEAN. And we can have a debate about how effective ASEAN has been with regards to Myanmar. But also the concretization of the Quad agenda with somewhat more, I think, less controversial agenda items like climate change, like public health diplomacy, like cyber and other emerging technologies. That's something that has been welcomed at different levels by Southeast Asian countries. It puts them in a less of a tight spot than I think what was originally expected. That said, I think with prevailing US-China fissures, with what's going on in Ukraine, that maneuvering space is likely to become a lot smaller for Southeast Asian states, at least in the near term. And you see this already with some of the diplomatic engagement campaigns that have been going on in Southeast Asia to get Southeast Asian capitals to either come out strongly in support of Ukraine or condemn Russia in a more overt way. And I don't know that this is as appreciated in Southeast Asian capitals. What you saw, I think, at the UN General Assembly vote was this willingness to deplore Russian aggression in a multilateral setting. But if you compel Southeast Asian countries to take a stand in a more unilateral fashion, you're probably going to be disappointed. My final point is, what does ASEAN unity, ASEAN centrality, ASEAN agency mean for ASEAN itself? What does it mean for ASEAN as a regional grouping? What does it mean for all the 10 member states of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN? And these are two very different considerations. right? What we're seeing with AUKUS, and there was a really lengthy and substantial fact sheet that was released by the White House yesterday on AUKUS. What was it, 17 working groups that have already been convened multiple times. I think that's really impressive. But the focus of AUKUS seems to be very defense forward. And the implications of that in the medium to long term are things that Southeast Asian capitals will have to grapple with, because again, it will reduce, I think, the maneuvering space for diplomacy amongst Southeast Asian capitals. So let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing from Zach and having a conversation.
Thank you so much, Alina. So, Zach, given that as much as I and everyone in the room deeply loves ASEAN, it is a bundle of contradictions. What does that mean for U.S. strategy in the region?
Well, first, thank you, Greg, for hosting this important conference. You've had so many great speakers the last few days, and thank you, Ted, also to USABC for doing this. So look, I think there's a tension here that we have to acknowledge, which is a central tension in U.S. strategy in Asia, which is between the Quad and ASEAN. And we can talk as much as we like about how the Quad respects ASEAN's centrality. But look, if you think about what's happened in, let's say, the last 5 years across Democratic and Republican administrations here in the United States, where has the United States put most of its effort? It's into things like the Quad and AUKUS, right? That's, we get a 17-page statement, but we still can't get the US-ASEAN Special Summit to actually happen. And we've been talking about this for almost a year and a half at this point. So I think we have to acknowledge that this is a real tension now. And in some ways, it's a tension between going for more depth in terms of the coalitions we're trying to build in Asia, right? Working with the countries that are willing to do the most, the fastest, right? Japan, Australia, sometimes India, right? Sometimes the United Kingdom and others. Or do we try and broaden out that group of countries that we're working so closely with? And I think what we've seen is that actually broadening is really hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons, right? Coups certainly have made the Biden administration's job much more difficult. But I think at the end of the day, there is a little bit of a tension here, and it's probably unavoidable. And my personal view is that we've probably underinvested in Southeast Asia, which is not to say that we're overinvested in Australia and Japan. Those are critical partners, right? But that at the end of the day, if you think in the long term about the countries that the United States can do a lot more with than it's already doing, I think a lot of those countries are in Southeast Asia. So I do think there's a little bit of a tension, if nothing else, just because of prioritization, right? So the president's going to have to decide where does he go on this trip he's taking in the next few months. And that's going to be an important signal, right? Does he go to the countries with which the United States has its closest alliance relationships, Japan, Korea, Australia, or does he do a stop through in Southeast Asia? I think Southeast Asians will be watching that, right? Whether we get a US-ASEAN Special Summit finally on the books, Southeast Asian friends will be watching that, right? Whether the president goes, hopefully he will, to the East Asia Summit and Apec, and the ASEAN meeting in the fall, that's going to, again, be extremely important. So I think there is a little bit of a tension here that we have to acknowledge, even if we can do both. There's a little bit of prioritization between the two. And then I think the other question is, frankly, can the U.S. deliver? Right? We've talked a lot, and this is not just a Biden administration thing. This was true in the Trump administration and frankly, back in the Obama administration as well. We've talked a lot about what the U.S. was going to do in the region, but often the U.S. talks more, in my view, than it actually delivers, right? And I think we heard a little bit of this morning with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, of which I'm quite hopeful, but I think we have to acknowledge that some of what Senator Cornyn said is fair, right? That what the region wants is probably a bit more than IPEF, right? What the region wants is some degree of trade liberalization, and that's not what the United States is offering. And so I think this is going to be a central tension that, as Paul said, right, the Indo-Pacific strategy that the White House put out, I think is a great document. What it says sounds wonderful. It's easy for friends in Asia to sign on board with most of it. I think the question they're asking isn't, are these the right objectives? It's, can the U.S. actually deliver, right? Can the Congress deliver? can administrations of both parties deliver over the long term? And I think on that question, to be very honest, it's still a bit unsure. And it's great that we have leaders like Kirk Campbell and folks in the cabinet departments that are working so hard to push on these issues. And certainly Secretary Raimondo, I think, has been a real leader on the economic side. But I think now the challenge for the Biden team is to say, look, we've set forth this strategy, and now we're going to put it in place. And so I think that's where we find ourselves at the moment.
Thanks, Zach. So, Paul, I'll come to you first to respond. I want to highlight one of the points made here, which is there is a big part of the tension, and I think U.S. strategy is between our political and security engagement on one hand and our economic engagement on the other. And I don't know what's going to come out of a US-ASEAN Special Summit, or when we get U.S. officials out in the region for the ARF or the ASEAN leaders meeting in the fall, but I guarantee that it's going to be a whole bunch of acronyms related to investment and trade and energy, and most of them are going to be new names for projects that we promoted during the Obama administration or even the Bush administration, which helps feed into, I think, some of this skepticism you talked about within ASEAN, that a lot of this feels like things that we've talked about for a decade, and yet we're not talking about an FTA. So, Paul, in general, how are the U.S. and like-minded, meaning the Quad, doing when it comes to balancing these economic demand signals from the region versus the security signals that we all spend so much time in Washington talking about?
So there's multiple layers there. So
I apologize.
How is Australia doing in balancing those? Extremely well. We are in CPTPP. We are in RCEP. We have bilateral agreements. We have, was that a massive strategic error on the part of the US to pull out of CPTPP? Yes, of course. I mean, unequivocal, massive. Is Zach absolutely correct that the US has failed to pay enough attention to Southeast Asia? Absolutely, without any doubt. We say it every day, every meeting, every session. When was how often does President Biden call President Widodo compared to how often does President Xi call President Widodo? I can tell you which way that tally goes. So there is absolutely no question there. Now, is the solution, I think you set up a juxtaposition, though, between US-ASEAN relations and US-Quad relations, which I don't think is fair. Because the way we look at the Quad is as the US coming to the region with friends and capability that is stronger than a purely unilateral approach. And from Australia's perspective, that's a better US engagement with ASEAN. If the US comes to ASEAN and comes to the Indo-Pacific with Australia, with India, with Japan, in partnership, that sets the stage for a more comprehensive, a more continuous, a more balanced, a less choose us or choose China tone to the whole thing. It positions it very much as about the sort of region you want, and it's not just a US vision for the sort of region you want. It's a vision that's shared by countries which are in many ways quite diverse, and so for me, the investment in the Quad that the US has made is not as investing there as against investing directly in ASEAN, but as a conduit, as a mechanism for that underlying investment in ASEAN. And look, I mean, the investment in AUKUS is a completely different investment. It's not an alliance. It's a capability. It's not a change in strategy. It's a change in capability. It's hard to even take seriously discussions around whether it contributes to heightened tension in the region when you look at the sheer pace and size of China's capability development. I mean, 8 Australian submarines, you know, they're very useful for us, but it's not going to shift the balance of military power in the region.
Alina, any thoughts?
No, but it might impact on the stability of the region in a positive or negative way, depending on which Southeast Asian country you ask. And I think we've seen this variety of responses in official statements. Contrast Singapore's statement with that of Indonesia's and Malaysia's, for example, with regard to AUKUS. I think there's definitely a greater weight that's been accorded to the security portion of the relationship, particularly with the US vis-a-vis ASEAN and Southeast Asian states. Of course, we've talked a lot about IPEF, so I think the region waits with full anticipation about what a fleshed out IPEF will look like. But I think we also should, to be fair, look at the US-Southeast Asia relationship in a more holistic manner. And I think we forget sometimes that there are efforts going on many other fronts, like the US-ASEAN Smart Cities Partnership, for example, YSEALI, which remains highly, highly popular amongst the youth of Southeast Asians. And so this talk about soft power is still there to a certain extent, building up the capabilities and capacity of the next generation in many forward-leaning aspects, climate change, small and medium enterprises, and a variety of other things that the younger generation are really passionate about. So I think there's great potential there in leveraging on that portion of the US-ASEAN relationship. I know Australia as well is doing a lot in the region with respect to some of those areas. So it's not just a security versus economic relationship that we should be attempting to assess. I think there are all these other parts that are often missed out. And one of the areas I think that really could do with a lot more bolstering is in the preservation of the arts and culture in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is so rich, we all know this, in its traditions and variety of its artisanship, things like craftsmanship, woodworking, textiles, you know, all of these are at risk of being lost in Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of work at the non-governmental stage that's going on, particularly with sometimes the revival. I know there's a project that has to do with the revival of the ancient Khmer kingdom, for example, bringing that to life in a 3D fashion, done by some universities in the US in partnership with those in Cambodia. And those are the kinds of things that are often understated and underappreciated that I think will have really long-term benefits for both the US and Southeast Asia.
Zach, before I let you finish out this round of questions, and I'll go to the audience, Alina, let me follow up with something. So it seems, I think to me, and I would suspect to many in the US government who are dealing directly with governments in South Asia, that there is not a singular mind, a singular demand signal from within the region for engagement on ASEAN centrality. On specific issues, in fact, there's plenty of partners in the region who ask for bilateral and trilateral and quad cooperation on issues on which ASEAN is unwilling to exercise its centrality or its agency. Be that the South China Sea or the Mekong. I'm sure many of us saw the last IC's South Asia survey. We all know how the public of Myanmar feels about ASEAN at the moment. So how are not just the US, but all dialogue partners expected to not undermine ASEAN centrality while also dealing with demand signals from the region that seemingly undermine ASEAN centrality?
Yeah, what I've heard is that, you know, the dysfunctionality of ASEAN makes it work somehow. So take it at face value. I think it's obviously very difficult to deal with 10 different countries with different priorities and different capacities. But the relationship with the US, with Australia, with Japan, etc., has all been working, humming along, let's say. It can be tweaked for improvement, of course. But I would just caution that the rhetoric about ASEAN centrality, particularly by dialogue partners, should match the reality. And I say this because I see fissures and I see a bit of dissonance between the rhetoric and reality. So there are all these proclamations of ASEAN centrality support, But then there is a preference that you allude to, Greg, of working with only certain partners on certain issues that risk leaving behind the rest of the ASEAN member states. It's a tricky balance. I don't have the answer, but I would just caution wisdom in going forward with that.
Thanks. Zach, I'm just going to let you respond to anything that you heard coming down the line.
Well, I mean, so I agree 100%, Elena, right? That this is one of the real challenges is that we all say ASEAN centrality, and sometimes we mean it, and sometimes it's just not a top priority, but we feel like we have to say it, which I think is a bit of a risky approach, and eventually we will get called out on these efforts, and I think that's potentially dangerous. I guess I would just say, you know, I think, Paul, you've got a really important point that, right, if we engage the Quad in an effective way, it can be an avenue into the region. My concern there is about whether we're doing enough of that kind of work within the Quad to outweigh some of the skepticism in the region. So, you know, for example, the Quad vaccine initiative, which I think is incredibly important, right? You know, I'd love to see that really accelerated so that we can actually be delivering real numbers of vaccines, right? Like, make this promise a reality, something that matters in Southeast Asia. You know, I think too often there is a core challenge within the Quad, which is that, you know, if you read a Quad leader statement, often it won't mention China, right? It's sometimes not even in the statement at all. And if you ask Quad leaders what the Quad is about, they'll often say, well, this really isn't about balancing against China, it's about all these other public goods. And I like that language. I would say the same thing if I were in government, but I think at the base level, what do India, the United States, Australia, and Japan have in common that other countries don't? We're willing to balance against China, right? That, in my view, is sort of the core of what the Quad is. And so I think there is a little bit of a challenge here, which is that when we think about building coalitions in Asia, you know, if you were going to build an economic coalition, would it be built around the Quad? Probably not, right? I mean, frankly, the US is not exactly an economic leader in terms of trade agreements at the moment. India is highly protectionist, so those aren't necessarily the countries you would pick. You know, we're doing a lot of supply chain work in the Quad, which I think is great. But again, you know, there's some other countries that you would think would be included in those supply chain discussions that aren't Quad members. And governance issues, you know, for example, what we're seeing right now with India on Russia, and you know, far more about Russia than I ever will, is, you know, I think India is going to be a great partner on security issues in Asia, right? But it might not be as active globally as the United States would like, and we're going to have to accept that reality. And so I think part of the challenge with the Quad is that we're doing a lot of things with the Quad in all of these other areas, but at its core, what the 4 Quad countries have most in common is a willingness to actually carry out some tough balancing efforts on the security side. And I think that's why it's a little bit tricky sometimes to deal with ASEAN, which is basically not willing to carry out a lot of those tough balancing efforts as a whole, certainly. And, you know, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, I think that's true of a lot of the ASEAN member states. So I think it's not so much a question of whether we're putting too much effort into the Quad or, you know, too little necessarily into Southeast Asia. It's about, you know, when do you engage the Quad and what's the purpose of doing so, and when do you have to engage ASEAN and what's the purpose in doing that. And I would just say, you know, I think the administration, it really needs to step up. And Greg, you mentioned the IS-EAS poll. I will say the most shocking number to me in that IS-EAS poll from this year was the fact that actually a lot of Southeast Asian experts think that US engagement decreased last year, right? That we were worse in the first year of Obama than we were at the end of the Trump administration. I mean, that was shocking for me. And I think as an American, that should be a bit bracing.
Greg, can I just jump in
Sure.
on one thing? And it's always a risk because I've got 2 thinkers and I'm a government representative, so I'm on a hiding to nowhere potentially here. But yeah, and so look, obviously the Australia, you know, there is a, you know, I think the Australian government is very proud and satisfied with the signalling effect and the impact that both the Quad, the revival of the Quad, and AUKUS have had. But they are two acronyms. Mm-hmm. They are not the universe of acronyms. Yeah. You know, we mentioned RCEP, we mentioned CPTPP. You know, one of the best dialogues I've been part of is Australia, Indonesia, India. Mm-hmm. We have as our closest, I think, strategically aligned at the moment partner in ASEAN, Vietnam. There's any number of different acronyms that are bubbling away, you know, under the surface. And I think, I mean, you know, Tanvi Maiden actually, you know, probably 2 years ago, wrote an article where, you know, looking at the Quad not as a standalone organisation, but the culmination of, you know, a whole range of interactions. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to, like, these headlines have been picked. And we're not looking at the depth of and the network of other engagements that's happening. Now, yes, do some of those pick off significant ASEAN countries that are, you know, willing to engage in a conversation like Indonesia or Vietnam? Yes, okay. Should we be having all of those conversations with the entirety of ASEAN? I don't think it works. Yeah. So, but don't be overly focused on it. There is more that Australia, the US, India even are doing in the region than just the Quad and AUKUS.
Thank you, Paul. I just went on the IC survey. It's telling that the last survey was done after the election in the US, before the inauguration. And so the drop in support wasn't actually between US engagement, it was the engagement expected, right? So
that was the previous year.
Yes, and so this year's numbers, when comparing, are actually showing a drop in the expected engagement from the Biden administration. Yeah. Not over the Trump administration. So even though I think most partners in the region feel like they've gotten more love than they did under the Trump administration, it wasn't the level they expected, and that is certainly telling. I had also flagged that the other survey result that caught my attention was that most elites in Southeast Asia support the Quad and support AUKUS. And levels of support there are a direct corollary to the last question. If forced to choose between the US and China, who would you pick? You can go right down the line and compare support for the Quad to those with the highest numbers who said US. With that, we've got a couple minutes since we started late here. Let me go to the first question from our online audience. And if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, I know it's a little intimidating, but we do have the stand mic, and we can invite you up to stand over there and let me know that you'd like to ask. So first, let me go to Shofan Albana Churizad, from Universitas Indonesia, who, touching on Alina's point earlier about the people-to-people ties, is currently a Fulbright US-ASEAN business scholar at American University here. We talked quite a bit about the Quad, so let me skip to Shofan's second question. The word inclusive in the Indo-Pacific was included in some US official speeches, but now it is not in the Indo-Pacific strategy. What does this mean? Zach, can I come to you on this? I just point out, I think there's a bigger question here, right? The Biden administration has had some difficulty deciding how many adjectives go before its Indo-Pacific strategy, and they change based on which agency you talk to. Is there anything to actually be read into that?
So I'm trying to remember, but I think the first version of the Indo-Pacific strategy that I saw still had inclusive in it, and I guess it maybe dropped out after that. Look, I think the Biden team wants an inclusive regional approach, right? The question is how best to do that, right? And does that inclusiveness mean that you are going to add countries onto existing groupings? Like, do you add them onto the Quad, right? Or do you add Australia, Korea, India onto the G7, right? What's the right way to get that inclusiveness? I wouldn't read anything into the possibility that inclusiveness isn't directly mentioned in the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think, you know, in talking with the team that wrote that document, they absolutely thought that inclusiveness was important. I think the tension they have in thinking through some of the language with which they want to address the region is, you know, they do want to be inclusive, but they also have to acknowledge that there's sometimes that you can't engage all of ASEAN as a group, right? And so you want to be inclusive and welcoming, but, you know, as Alina and Paul have said, you don't want to allow that to stop engagement broadly, right? So, and I think we saw a little bit of that the first year where, just because of the coup in Myanmar, you sort of had a bit of a pause in how we engaged ASEAN. But I don't think that there's any specific limitation on the idea of inclusiveness coming out of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that's something that the Biden team certainly believes in.
I'm going to steal John Brandon's question as my wrap-up question here. So John at the Asia Foundation said, Zach said the U.S. is underinvesting in Southeast Asia. So what more should the U.S. be doing in Southeast Asia? And I think his second part here is very interesting. Should the U.S. be investing more ASEAN-wide or in key countries like Indonesia? Are we negligent uniformly, or are we negligent in specific cases? And maybe I'll reverse the order here and just start with Paul. You don't have to just talk to the U.S. I know that makes you uncomfortable. You could say what Canberra's not doing well. That would be fine.
On the evening of election, that might make me even more uncomfortable. Look, I think I think we need to be careful at suggesting that the US isn't doing anything. I mean, at the end of the day, there have been a lot of vaccines delivered and a lot of engagement in the first year of the Biden administration. There seems to be a commitment. We expect the president to attend all of the summits. I think the symbolism of the way that they very clearly focused on treaty allies, which include Philippines, which include Thailand, and the like in their first year of administration. There have been some very, very important signals. More can definitely be done. They need an economic proposition, which is not to say that there isn't, a huge base of, historic capital, accumulated US capital, business capital, and soft power capital in Southeast Asia. There is, but on a year-to-year basis, what's the next thing that's being engagement? It's not there, so they need to do that. And I do think we have some incredibly important individual countries that will be frankly more decisive in shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific than potentially the Quad countries, who are, in many regards, looking to open up the strategic space for significant ASEAN countries to, be resilient, act on their national interest, ensure that their sovereignty isn't infringed or their space for sovereign decision making isn't infringed. And I think the US should be doing more to invest heavily in those individual countries, and certainly Indonesia and Vietnam are right up there on that list.
Alina?
So the question that I have is related to the calculations on which countries are decisive at what point in time, right? So countries that may be important now may not be as important for particular issues further down the road. Countries that are often overlooked and dismissed now, thinking of one particular smaller country in Southeast Asia now, that is often given short shrift, suddenly becomes a strategic point of importance when a naval base is looked upon with askance. And so this balancing of which countries are important at what point in time, I think is something for Australia, the US, and all to figure out. And that's why I caution wisdom about picking countries and prioritizing some over others. That's it.
Thanks. Zach?
So, Alina, I take the point. I guess I do think, though, the U.S. is going to have to make some decisions about where it puts investment of time and resources. And I think we've started to see a bit of a decision from the administration about where they're going to prioritize. I think the fact that Tony Blinken tried to give the Indo-Pacific vision and strategy presentation in Jakarta was a pretty clear signal that, Indonesia is going to be a focus. I think there have and frankly, you know, engaging Indonesia has been hard because of the challenges traveling there. So being there on the ground, I think that took real commitment by the administration. Clearly, you know, they sent the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense last summer. Both went to Singapore, both went to Vietnam. I think that shows that those are, you know, pretty critical partners in their minds. And of course, you know, the Philippines, we'll see what happens with the election, but I think the Philippines as a U.S. treaty ally is going to be critical. I think that, you know, maybe leaves the two members of ASEAN that probably need a bit more attention, but both are going to be a little challenging. You know, Malaysia would absolutely be one of them, a big critical country, but where we haven't had as much U.S. engagement as you might have seen in other parts of Southeast Asia. And then Thailand, right, where I do think the defense relationship with Thailand remains quite good, but the broader political relationship, I think, is really a challenge. So, you know, it's not to say that the rest of ASEAN isn't important, but I think the more we pick apart ASEAN's centrality and acknowledge we're going to have to engage different parts of ASEAN at different times on different issues, I think that really puts those 6 countries at the top of the list, which is not to say, as Alina was mentioning, right, that we can ignore the rest of ASEAN, but is just to say, for an administration that's going to be thinking about visits coming up over the next 6 months, you know, where do we think they're going to go? Where are ambassadors most needed? Where are presidential phone calls most needed? I think those 6 are likely to be at the top of the list. Exactly what the order is, I don't know, but I certainly hope we'll see, you know, as much engagement as they can fit in between now and summit season in the fall.
Thanks. And with the recent nomination of an ambassador to Thailand, I think we've now got a name at least for all 10, although we're still missing the ASEAN Secretariat.
Yeah.
Well, that is it for the panel and very nearly it for the conference. If you could all join me thanking Paul, Lena, and Zach for their time. Thank you very much. I'm going to let them go, and I'd ask Ted, if you don't mind, if you want to come up on the stage, we'll say some closing words and then let everybody get on with their day. This way we don't have to rearrange a podium or anything.
No, we don't.
So, thank you all for coming for our first big in-person, you know, return to hybrid conferencing. I'm sorry we couldn't have everybody there. We'll start to, hopefully, fingers crossed, fit in more chairs month by month, and you know, until we're back to the good old days or something like it. But I still think we'll have a lot of people who want to watch from their sweatpants, and I get that. For those in the room, we're going to have some lunch outside if you'd like to join us. I'm not going to rehash why all of this was important. I'll leave that to Ted maybe. I just want to say thank you. No. Thank you so much. You can, if you missed anything, it'll be online, YouTube, on csis.org, and we'll have the transcripts from all the conversations up for everybody to make use of. Ted?
I'm not going to rehash why all this is important either, but that last panel was kind of a reminder of why it's all important. So I was glad that we ended on that note. It's nice when thinkers balance government officials. It's actually it's great. Thanks to all of you very much. Thanks to my friend Greg and to Dr. Hamre and CSIS. Thanks to our team. Bernie's back there in the corner, but he worked very, very hard to pull this, and Ryan. So thanks to everybody for contributing. I hope it is the first annual and that we'll be able to do this again next year. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.